Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today I have for you what is the final installment in my CPU architecture progress benchmark series. Bit of a mouthful there, it's almost like a monitor name. Anyway, this time we are comparing a decade of AMD and Intel CPUs head to head. Now, for those of you who missed the first few videos in this series, this all began with a look at the Intel 10th generation core series, comparing the Core i3, i5, i7 and i9 models at the same core frequency and core count. This gave us a clear and very interesting look at how L3 cache capacity influences gaming performance, and we found that for today's games, Intel often saw its biggest performance uplifts when increasing the L3 cache capacity rather than adding more cores. So by limiting all CPUs to just 4 active cores with 8 threads at the same clock frequency, we got a really good look at stuff that hasn't really been tested before, and that led to comparisons with older Intel CPUs. Naturally, the next step was to do the same with AMD processors while normalizing the core count and clock frequency, and this exposed just how weak the FX series was, and just how much of an improvement AMD has made and continued to make with Ryzen. In the end, this CPU architecture benchmark was a really interesting way of looking at the progress both companies had made. Now all that was left to do was test a few more generations such as Sandy Bridge, Ivy Bridge, Haswell, and of course Rocket Lake, and throw all that data together. So for this test, all CPUs were clocked at 4.2 GHz with the exception of the Ryzen 7 1800X, which was clocked at 4.1 GHz, but that's just a 2.5% frequency discrepancy that won't really influence the data in a meaningful way. Models using DDR4 memory were paired with DDR4 3200CL14, and then the DDR3 models used DDR3 2400CL11 memory. Other than that, everything is as apples to apples as it possibly can be, with every model running with 4 cores active. Please note though, no cores were disabled on the FX 8350, so if you believe that that's an 8-core CPU, then I guess 8 cores were active. Whatever the case though, it's either a really slow quad-core or a beyond terrible 8-core processor, so I'll leave it up to you guys to pick which one of those you prefer to think of it as. And finally, for this look at game performance, I'm going to be using the Radeon RX 6900 XT for all the testing. Okay, let's dig into the data. Starting with the Rainbow Six Siege results, we see when comparing the 2012 options, so the Piledriver and Ivy Bridge architectures, we see that Intel delivered a 21% greater average frame rate and a 29% stronger 1% low, so a significant advantage to Intel there, and as a result AMD was forced to sell their parts at a much lower price, and that really stung given that the FX dies were almost twice the size at 315mm squared, and it also meant they were significantly more power hungry. Then from Ivy Bridge to Haswell, we're looking at a very strong 23% performance uplift, and I don't recall seeing margins that big back in 2013, but of course games weren't as demanding back then, and GPUs weren't nearly as powerful. In fact, back then it was extremely difficult to highlight the benefits of SMT technology for games. By 2013 though, things were already getting dire for AMD, as they were now competing with Haswell, and clock for clock Intel was ahead by almost 50%, at least in this example. Broadwell with its eDRAM doesn't offer much over Haswell here, just a 4% gain, so nothing to write home about. Along with Broadwell, we also received Skylake in 2015, and by this point, virtually no one even uttered the name AMD when discussing CPUs, and that's because, with all things equal, Intel was now offering 73% greater performance in this example. But this is also where things started to stagnate for Intel. From Skylake to Kaby Lake, we see their smallest performance gain in generations. Basically nothing was gained from the 6700K to the 7700K. Then, as we discovered recently, since Skylake, the only way Intel has really been able to improve performance in a meaningful way has been to increase the L3 cache capacity, and of course add more cores, but we didn't look at that. And this started with the 8700K, which jumps up from the 7700K's 8MB L3 cache to 12MB, and this resulted in a mere 4% performance boost in Rainbow Six Siege. Then Intel upgraded to a 16MB L3 cache with the 9900K, and although the core count for this test has been locked at 4, and the clock frequency remains the same at 4.2 GHz, the frame rate was increased by 5%. Of course, while Intel was stuck with what was essentially Skylake, but with more cores and cache, AMD had reappeared on the scene. Ryzen was unleashed for the first time in 2017, so 5 years after the FX 8350 was launched, and the first generation architecture was almost 40% faster in this example when compared to the FX series. Now, as impressive as that game was, it meant AMD was still miles behind Intel when it came purely to gaming performance. In this example, they'd roughly caught up to Haswell, so where Intel was back in 2013. Of course, first generation Ryzen was still very appealing as it offered many more cores and as such was a productivity beast. So although the gaming performance wasn't exactly impressive, it was good enough and there were plenty of other positives that helped make the series a success and a good step in the right direction for AMD. But as Intel added 2 more cores with Coffee Lake, AMD needed to press forward, and they did that with Zen Plus. And here we're seeing with the 2700X, which has half its cores disabled, it offered a decent 9% improvement. Still 17% slower than Intel's 2018 architecture, but the gap was slowly closing. And it was 2019 when things really heated up. AMD launched Zen 2, and now they were hot on the heels of Intel. Here we see the 3800X trailing the 9900K by just a 3% margin when matched at the same core count and frequency, though both are 8-core processors. Intel CPUs at the time did clock a bit better though, so the margin was a bit more like 5 to 10%, but still AMD was right there. Then, 2020 is where it all came crashing down for Intel. AMD released Zen 3, and it was the final death blow for the 14nm process. Clock for clock, AMD was now 16% faster, and of course, Zen 3 did clock very well. So for the most part, AMD was now faster for gaming. Intel did try to lessen the blow with Rocket Lake, and while some gains were made, in some instances, like what we see here, Intel actually managed to take a big step backwards. So that was a long look at the Rainbow Six Siege results, therefore I will summarise some of the following games. Such as Assassin's Creed Valhalla, for example, which provides us with far less interesting data, as this one is mostly GPU limited and really doesn't make good use of the CPU. We see that Intel capped out with the introduction of Skylake, and AMD never managed to catch them. But if we look back to 2012, where Intel was up to 56% faster, today that margin is just 7% in Intel's favour, at least when matched clock for clock at the same core count. Battlefield 5 was brutal on the AMD FX 8350. Here it managed just 47 FPS on average, while the 3770K was good for 95 FPS, a 102% performance increase from Intel in 2012. And if that wasn't bad enough, Intel managed to achieve a 37% increase with Haswell, jumping up to 130 FPS on average, an almost 180% increase from the FX 8350. Then from Haswell to Broadwell, we see a modest 8% increase, and from Broadwell to Skylake, just a 4% increase, while KB Lake offered nothing new. After that, Ryzen arrived, and we're again looking at Haswell-like performance, though that's not entirely true. While the average frame rates were much the same, in fact the first gen Ryzen is about 6% slower here, the 1% low performance of Ryzen was almost 30% greater, leading to a far better gaming experience thanks to much smoother frame rates. AMD then achieved an 11% increase from Zen to Zen Plus, while Intel boosted clock-to-clock performance by 5% by increasing the L3 cache capacity of their Core i7 range. Again, it was Zen 2 where AMD really started to apply pressure, boosting performance from Zen Plus by 16%, and in this example, that was enough to match Intel at the same core count and clock frequency. This time though, Intel does see a performance uplift with their 11th generation, jumping up to 177 FPS on average, which is a 10% boost, though the 1% low figure wasn't really improved. Despite that improvement, AMD is still out in front with Zen 3, offering 8% more performance on average. This means from 2017, Intel has achieved a performance improvement of 20%, while AMD almost tripled that with a 57% improvement from Zen to Zen 3, so very impressive stuff there from AMD. F1 2020 isn't as hard on the CPU as Battlefield 5, but even so we see strong gains across most of the generations, especially when looking at the AMD architectures. The 2012 matchup sees Intel able to deliver 46% greater performance with Ivy Bridge when compared to Piledriver. Then from Ivy Bridge to Haswell we see a modest 12% increase, and this time Broadwell offered a 10% boost over Haswell. So for a few years there, Intel was managing to eke out some decent gains on the 14nm process without adding more cores. But again, that all came to a screeching halt with Skylake, and we see no real change from the 6700K to the 8700K, which was a problem for Intel as AMD had started to strike back with Ryzen. In this example, Ryzen wasn't exactly amazing out of the gate, with the 1800X only able to match the 5-year-old 3770K. Zen Plus gets AMD up to speed with the Haswell architecture, or thereabouts, and Zen 2 puts them on par with Broadwell, and not a great deal behind Skylake through to Coffee Lake. Then, a massive boost with Zen 3 sees them hit the lead, and even the most recent Rocket Lake architecture can't beat Zen 3. Hitman 2 shows an 11% performance increase from Sandy Bridge to Ivy Bridge, which isn't something we've often seen, though I wonder how much of this is down to the difference in PCI Express bandwidth, given we're comparing PCIe 2.0 versus 3.0. Whatever the case though, it means that in 2012, Intel's architecture offered 33% more performance in this title. Then, from 2012 to 2013, Intel managed to improve performance by a whopping 38%, and that meant their lead over AMD was now blown out to 84%. And as we've seen a number of times now, Intel did manage reasonable performance gains from Haswell to Broadwell, then to Skylake, and that's where things slowed considerably for the blue team. It wasn't until the 11th gen that Intel managed a solid performance uplift. In this example, it was enough to beat AMD's Zen 3. But well before the arrival of Zen 3, AMD did have to make do with first generation Zen, and here they were still slower than Intel's 5-year-old Haswell architecture. Zen Plus did get them on par with Haswell, and then Zen 2 pushed them up to Skylake, which meant they were now also comparable with Coffee Lake. For Intel, the Horizon Zero Dawn data is very similar to Assassin's Creed Valhalla in the sense that they were able to max this one out with Skylake. AMD, on the other hand, took until Zen 3 to get there, meaning AMD improved performance by just over 50% from 2017 to 2020, while Intel made no real gains. But of course, Intel was already well out in front, but this does show great innovation from AMD compared to complete stagnation from Intel. Okay, moving on to Cyberpunk 2077, and what we have here doesn't look that dissimilar to other CPU-demanding games that we've already checked out. In 2012, Intel enjoyed a 48% architectural performance advantage, and by 2015 that margin more than doubled to 110% with Skylake. This is why the FX series was such a disaster for the company. And aware that it was a failure, they had to completely shift gears with a fundamental redesign, and that took time. So from 2012, it would be 5 years before we would see another flagship CPU from AMD, and in that time, they were forced to do battle with Intel, who in this example had a 110% architectural advantage while using half as much power. Very brutal stuff there. But what we can see here is Intel's steady refinement of their 14nm process up until Skylake. From Sandy Bridge to Skylake, Intel found almost 50% more performance over a 4-year period, which is remarkable. However, from Skylake to Rocket Lake, which is a 6-year gap, they've found just 13% more performance in this example, and that really allowed AMD to close in. Now, the second last game we're going to test is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and again, we see that back in 2012, Intel enjoyed the benefit of a significantly more efficient architecture, delivering 32% more performance at the same frequency. Then, from Ivy Bridge to Haswell, we see a further 23% increase for Intel, and from Haswell to Broadwell, a 13% increase. Then, things start to slow down. Skylake was just 5% faster than Broadwell here, and that means from the 6th generation to the 10th, Intel boosted performance by just 6%. We also see AMD shadowing Haswell with Zen, and then matching it with Zen Plus. But by the time Zen 2 arrived, AMD were up to speed, and then they raced ahead with Zen 3, though Intel did catch them up a little bit with Rocket Lake. Watch Dogs Legion provides us with another good example of Intel's stagnation over the last 6 years, essentially hitting a brick wall with Skylake, though they recently overcame that in this example with Rocket Lake. But again, we're only talking about a 12% increase 6 years after the release of Skylake. We also see, once again, just how brutal pre-2017 was for AMD. Back in 2012, for this example, Intel was 31% faster. But a year later, they managed to blow that margin out to 95% with Haswell, and AMD wouldn't be able to match that level of performance until 2017 with Zen. So that data provided some really interesting insight into how AMD and Intel CPU architectures have compared over the past decade. We've seen AMD come from absolutely nowhere to now beating Intel in quite a few tests, with Intel coming from miles ahead to now 6 years of mostly stagnation, at least when discussing the architecture, the architectural refinements. Anyway, let's now take a look at the 9-game average before wrapping this one up. Well, these results aren't terribly surprising given what we just saw. Back in 2012, Intel was ahead by a 43% margin on average when comparing the FX 8350 and Core i7 3770K at the same frequency. That's a massive performance difference, compounded by the fact that AMD consumed significantly more power. And sadly, that wasn't the worst case scenario for AMD. Just a year later, Intel had extended that margin to 77%, and then by 2015, they were 110% ahead. And technically, the 6700K wasn't even Intel's flagship desktop part in 2015. That honor goes to the Core i7 5960X and its 20MB L3 cache, but that's a completely different story. So, given the massive performance discrepancy, AMD was forced to slash pricing from the $195 US MSRP, the introductory price in 2012, to just $120 US in 2015, with some sales seeing it drop as low as $90 US. That's $90 US for a current generation flagship AMD processor. That'd be like AMD having to sell a part like the 5800X for less than $200 today, had the situation not improved for them. Thankfully for everyone, except maybe Intel, the situation did improve for AMD, and although Zen wasn't a gaming monster in 2017, it was good enough, and with numerous other strengths, was a success and a great CPU series. Zen Plus continued that trend in 2018, and by 2019, AMD was smashing Intel's desktop CPU sales. I know I've already said it, but this really was an interesting look at the architectural performance differences for gaming between AMD and Intel processors over the past decade. And for me, it really does highlight just why our content, and that of many others, has been so positive towards AMD's Ryzen processors from about 2018 onwards, and why I was so pro-Intel prior to 2017. It was extremely difficult to recommend AMD CPUs for gaming back in 2012, and the following years only saw it become increasingly difficult. It's really wild to see that from 2015 to 2021, that the gaming performance of Intel's architecture has improved by just 11%, whereas AMD saw a 48% increase from 2017 to 2020. But the arrival of Ryzen marked a turning point, and while I wasn't completely sold on the first generation, at least not for gaming, there were plenty of scenarios where you could recommend AMD, and that in itself was a big deal at the time. Based on the data just seen, you can see why Zen Plus started to shift things in AMD's favour, and sure, they were still well down on Intel for gaming when CPU limited, but a lot of the time games aren't CPU limited, and not all gamers want to just game. And that, in my opinion, made Ryzen a much more well-rounded solution, especially given the price tag. With AMD and Intel now evenly matched in terms of gaming performance, though AMD does have a significant efficiency advantage, which is quite funny looking back at the 2012 data, but given how competitive things are now, I can't wait to see what the next generation of hardware brings. Of course, we'll have Intel's 12th generation Alder Lake CPU soon, and they promise massive changes for Intel, so obviously that is very exciting, and I can't wait to get into the testing. So make sure you stick around for that. And yeah, that is going to do it for this, what's probably going to be the final installment in this series for now, though, you know, Alder Lake around the corner. It might be interesting to add some 12th gen data to this, and we'll see how far into the future we can carry it. But anyway, if you guys enjoyed it, let me know if you'd like to see us add Alder Lake in a few months' time. But yeah, that is really going to do it for this one. If you like the video, do give it a like, please. You can subscribe for more content. And if you'd like to become a Hardware Unboxed community member and get some pretty cool perks in return, then Floatplane, Patreon, links for those are in the video description. You'll get access to our exclusive Discord server where we have an absolutely amazing tech community. I reckon probably the best tech community there is. Big call, I know, but I think it's a safe one. We also have a monthly live stream where Tim and I are getting engaged with the Hardware Unboxed community. Behind the scenes content, Q&As, a lot of cool stuff there. So if you're interested, check the links out. It is definitely worth checking that stuff out. But if not, perfectly fine. I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.